so it's nearly 5 past. There are lecture slides here, print out the lecture slides. You want to collect them, and there's a attendance sheet going around. Someone very kindly and patiently waited and gave it to me at the end of the lecture last week, so if someone else could do this, we'd be handy. You don't have to be kind or patient. It would be nice if you gave it back to me, because I will forget. Okay, so this week we're doing British chemical industry. There'll be a lot about drugs, both illicit and non-illicit, but mostly the pharmaceuticals, the prescription drugs. The last time I gave a lecture similar to this, someone in the PR department of Queen Mary University, where I was teaching, asked whether some potential American students could bring their parents to the lecture, and I said yes. Then I remembered I was doing the chemical industry. Anyway, we'll see why. We'll see why later. Okay, so the chemical industry is a typical second-generation industry, yeah, so there's no benefit necessarily in being a first mover, as in Britain having industrialised first doesn't necessarily benefit. We've been talking about this a lot post-1945, okay, so this is chemicals, and there was electricity. This isn't about cotton textiles anymore, this isn't about steam, this isn't about water, this isn't about coal anymore. It's something that captures, though, both Britain's successes and failures in the post-war era, the chemical industry. First, though, I want to flag up some of the things that we thought about when we were talking about education, when we were talking about R&D, when we were talking about some of the other industries, which is the difference between process innovation and product innovation. Think about that as we go through this. So the lecture outline, first we'll talk about beer, and then we'll talk about industrial chemicals, and then we'll talk about consumer chemicals, and then we'll talk about pharmaceuticals, and then we'll talk about drinking free beer. Okay, so this presumably has been flagged up to you already. Today, and I think it's mandatory for second years, you have to attend this introduction to the third year courses. So there are various options you can do, and there are various kind of obligatory kind of courses that you have to do if you're an economic history student. And it's in room D402. Are you aware of this, anyone? Yeah? Between 6:15 and I think it's only going to last about half an hour, yeah? And the carrot, that's the stick, the carrot is free beer afterwards, yeah? My experience of these things, though, is that free beer does not last very long. You don't have to drink beer, it's free drink, and it's in the upper room of the George. And if you're a third year, as some of you are, you don't have to do the stick thing, you just have to do the carrot thing, which is go to the pub and drink free beer. The free beer thing, as I say, is not obligatory, but if you're a second year or a first year, but there aren't any first years here, then you are obliged to go to this thing first, yeah? So Gerben will introduce, yeah?
What room is it?
It's in D402, between 6:15 and 7, but free beer is available from 6 o'clock in the George, okay? So how many third years are here? Okay, so the third years, there aren't that many third years, but the third years will be drinking it from 6 o'clock onwards, okay, so, and it doesn't last, is my experience. Okay, but it's a nice thing to go there and meet faculty, yeah? I don't know how much involvement you have with faculty other than, you know, office hours and various other teaching stuff, but, you know, it's relaxed kind of networking. Okay, so I've done the free beer thing, so there it is. D402, 6:15 to 7 o'clock. First and second years, free drink. Third years go straight to the pub. Okay, so the chemical industry. When we think about the chemical industry, we're really thinking of a 20th century industry, or 20th century industries. I mean, obviously there were things happening in the 19th century, but it was pretty primitive. It's not until the 20th century that things really kick off. And it's not a single industry. There's really three industries. There's industrial chemicals, and then there's consumer chemicals, and then there's pharmaceuticals. All very separate. All of them involve chemists at some stage of the game, but even the chemists, even the people at the professional end, do not tend to transfer between one sector, industrial chemicals, and pharmaceuticals, or vice versa. Similarly, the companies, Procter & Gamble and Unilever, do not try and invent anti-AIDS drugs. They don't involve themselves in industrial chemicals. They do specialise in their particular sector. So when we're looking at one industry, the chemical industry, it's really like three industries, and our focus will be on what Britain has done best in the post-war period, which is pharmaceuticals. Bear in mind, while we're going through all of this, that difference between process innovation and product innovation. When we're looking at, so we'll start with industrial chemicals, and we'll start with ICI, because for all intents and purposes that is British industrial chemicals. Owen is very good on this, okay, for the background of it, and ICI obviously benefits from First World War reparations, and ICI is no more. It's a subsidiary of AkzoNobel since 2008. For most of the period that we're interested in, this is economic history, the post-war period, ICI was dominant, and the second largest was BP in BP Chemicals, but ICI was much, much bigger. And it was a very successful innovator. So in terms of product innovation, ICI was very, very, very good. So polythene, polyester, a number of herbicides. Dulux paint. Dulux paint is surprisingly more complicated than you think. So it's an emulsion. What's an emulsion? You've all done a bit of science somewhere, even if it's home economics. Even in home economics we come across emulsions. What does an emulsion do? There will be a bit of chemistry here, and I know there are some really good chemistry students here. One of my general course students, who's my academic advisor, who isn't here, is doing a medical degree, and so she can pick me up on a lot of this stuff. So what's an emulsion? Sorry, at the back there?
I don't know.
You don't know? It's kind of something that joins water-based molecules with oil-based molecules, isn't it? So Dulux is a complex paint. When you paint something, you'll pick up a can. If it's been sitting for a while, you need to shake it or stir it. Well, the point of Dulux is its innovative element, if you like, is it didn't need that much stirring or shaking. And so then when you paint it on a wall, it doesn't leave lines. It's a consistent colour. The company that took over ICI was, as well as many other things, it was Crown Paints, but the European Commission made it sell off Crown Paints when it bought ICI. That's a kind of monopolies and mergers thing. It was seen as too dominant in that market. They were rayon, which is an artificial silk, which predates polyester, terylene, and DuPont, the American chemical giant, created something else. What did they create? So we've got the Dutch company, Akzo created rayon, ICI created terylene, brand name terylene, polyester. What did DuPont create? As in Alfred DuPont Chandler, yeah? Yeah, right? Nylon, absolutely. That's what every American GI had in his pocket, yeah? Some nylons. Okay, we'll come back to GIs later. So, ICI was successful in product innovation, but not successful in process innovation, or at least explicitly not successful in sales. So in the interwar period, the world was kind of carved up between the Germans, the Americans, and the British. The British having benefited from German technology after the First World War, and ICI had the Empire, DuPont had the Americas, and IG Farben had continental Europe. This is this period, this interwar period of the cartelisation of world production, if you like. And the problem was for ICI that this cartelised world continued into the 1980s. Essentially, it stuck with what was the empire and what became the Commonwealth, and that was its market. So we're seeing links between this and other industries in terms of British decline. And we can see it here. So the direction of sales from ICI. So the UK, which is a relatively small market for industrial chemicals, is well over half. And the US is tiny, and that's a huge market. And Western Europe is also tiny. Australia, large continent, large country, small population. That's almost as big as Western Europe for ICI sales. And there we have other countries, okay, so it's geared towards small and relatively declining markets, or at least for most of this post-war period, for most of the period that ICI exists. Just so after the war we have Marshall Aid, we have American assistance to stop us all becoming communists, and part of that Marshall Aid was this Anglo-American Council. You've probably read about this in Owen. Members of various industries went over to America immediately after the Second World War to see how the Americans did things. So you'd have everyone from the board to union representatives and shop floor workers. And they were flabbergasted by how rich America was, how little damage it seemed to have sustained in the war. And bear in mind, this was a period of austerity in Britain. Okay, there was still rationing and shortage of many things, particularly imported things. And what they come away with is the typical story that productivity is so much higher. But what they also come away with, and think back to your lecture on education, they come away with this, that they found that the ratio of skilled to unskilled workers in the chemical industry in Britain was 1 to 16, in the US was 1 to 6. So again, this has ramifications in this particular sector to both process and product innovation. Yeah, the ability to roll out new ways of doing things, new ways of gaining economies of scale. ICI tried to follow what SO initiated, which was to try and break down labour barriers, job differentiation. Now SO, which is part of Exxon, now part of ExxonMobil, they had kind of the money to do it. They could buy their workers off. ICI didn't, but it tried to do the same thing. So there's a difference between, using this manpower utilisation and payment structure, they tried to get weekly paid staff to be more like salaried staff. There is still this differentiation in the British economy even now. Strangely enough, I'm salaried staff, I have to be paid monthly and it has to go into my bank account. I believe there are still some members of LSE staff who can opt to be paid weekly. This is a big difference, and the difference in this industry is in job demarcation, and we've come across this in the car industry, we've come across this in many industries. Now the workers see this as a way of management to get them to do more for less, whereas management see it as a way of rolling out new technology. And so the workers are obviously averse to this, and management really failed to get much done. And so this was a real problem in process innovation. Yeah. So ICI good at product innovation, but unable to successfully implement much process innovation, and that has ramifications in terms of productivity. So by the 1980s, ICI essentially do what a lot of other British industries do, which is they move out of all these areas where they can't make any money anymore. So they move out of bulk chemicals and they sell, for instance, all their agricultural chemicals go to AstraZeneca. And they stick to the high end, so they stick to things like complex paints and various things where they feel a bit like British Steel, but they feel that they can still make money. So the British steel industry concentrated in its latter stage at manufacturing high-tech steels, things like external stainless steels. There are lots of different grades of stainless steel. There are marine grades, and this is something that British Steel did quite well once it had moved out of the cheap bulk sector. And this is what ICI do. So they just retreat from where they can't make any money, partly because there's failure to implement process innovation. Consumer chemicals. Consumer chemicals are largely, particularly early on, they're largely soaps of one sort or another. So there's natural soaps, and then there's synthetic soaps, detergents. And there's this long-lasting duopoly. Two manufacturers that dominate the market, and they still exist today. So there was Lever Brothers, we've come across those over and over again. So Lord Lever, who buys Scottish Island, and they become Unilever when they merge with a Dutch margarine manufacturer. I think I said soap manufacturer before. The Dutch margarine manufacturer, Uni, and become Unilever, and Procter & Gamble absorb Headley's. Headley's of Fairy soap. Oops, I've skipped a few too many there. Have you heard of Fairy soap? Is Fairy soap still on the market? It is. Well, It's a Procter & Gamble product, and like Lever Brothers, they have just bought brands, so they're a conglomerate. The literature has it, though, that this duopoly doesn't act like a monopoly. It is highly competitive, and the profits aren't excessive, and there are high rates of innovation and good productivity, which kind of is not intuitive to us. But there are these, as you come into the literature, there are these fierce fights between Procter & Gamble and Unilever over products. I'll come back to this later. And it's the battleground between Persil and Ariel. There are lots of other brands on the market, but they're essentially Persil and Ariel with a few ingredients taken out. So Bold and, other brands of washing powder. So Unilever, as well as owning, as we've discussed before, as well as owning a lot of food brands, the soap brands are Organics, shampoo, competing directly with Procter & Gamble's. Is this Pantene? This is a shampoo, yeah? Is it still around? Yeah. It is. And so there's Comfort, which is a fabric softener, which competes with Procter & Gamble's Lenor. And there's the renamed Cif. I think it was about 10 years ago. It used to be Jif in Britain. It's very difficult to rename an existing product. So this was done because Jif was difficult to pronounce, I believe, in some continental European markets and some worldwide markets, possibly Spanish, not sure. But they rebranded it Cif, which is easier to pronounce, and that competes directly with Procter & Gamble's Flash. These two really and I believe the nappy market, not any of you will know about the nappy market. I unfortunately do know about the nappy market. So there's Pampers and Huggies, I believe, and one is Procter & Gamble and one is Unilever. So there's these latter ones, in consumer chemicals as opposed to industrial chemicals are all about process innovation. Consumer chemicals are partly about process innovation, but also about product innovation. These are complex things. I was under the impression that shampoos were just soaps. It's just an expensive way of buying soap. I'm not so sure about this now, or at least I'm told it's not the same. Not everyone washes their hair in soap, and that there is an element of product innovation here. Possibly some of the innovation is just marketing, but unlike industrial chemicals. Okay, so now at the high end of the market is pharmaceuticals, and this is all about product innovation, and to the extent that process innovation is almost irrelevant. Okay, we're going to start with a very quick potted history of pharmaceuticals. If you want a better economic history of pharmaceuticals, then go along later on and see whether Patrick Wallace's teaching a third year course on, because this was his kind of specialist subject, if this was Mastermind, it is the development of consumer pharmaceuticals. Okay, so the industry starts with quacks. It then evolves into chemistry, which is empirically tested, and then we have kind of lab science. Some of the big names in the industry, even now, do have their roots in quack medicine, apothecaries, as they might want to be known. So Allen and Hanbury, this is their headquarters in East London somewhere, if it's still there. They were absorbed by Glaxo quite a long time ago, and Merck, the German company, both have their roots in kind of quack medicine. Also things like Glaxo, Allen and Hanbury also made baby milk formula. And this is quite near here, 24 the Strand. This is Professor, although self-called Professor, he was never given a professorship, he never did a doctorate. Professor Holloway attends daily at 24 the Strand at the establishment from 9 till 12 in the morning and from 7 till 9 in the evening. So extended office hours with Professor Holloway. And advice gratis, so free advice. But his advice would be, take some of my pills or take some of my ointment. Most of the quack medicine, and again, talk to Patrick about this, most quack medicine was based on herbs, and it was essentially a laxative. Okay, so there was a demonstrative effect. You took the medicine, and you, can I put this politely? No, I can't. And so you had to have a dump. Okay, and in having a dump, you could see that this medicine was having an effect. And you went back to the quack, not Professor Holloway, you went back to the quack and you said, you know, I'm going to the loo quite frequently, and the quack would then tell you, well, that's the medicine working. You're getting the poison out of your system. Professor Holloway, who was the market leader, I think in 1851, he dominated the market. His ointments, so there was a universal external ointment, and then there was a universal orally taken pill. They didn't even have a laxative effect, okay? However, he made a lot of money. He made so much money that he built this. What is this?
Royal Holloway.
Royal Holloway, exactly, Royal Holloway. He died before it was built, but he made enough money to pay for that, so it's a big house. So there was money in this thing, and this wasn't that long ago. This seems like ancient history. This is the middle of the 19th century, okay? This is how far things have moved on. Okay, so from the 17th century onwards, though, we're looking at things like tanning, things like dyeing, okay, dyes for wool, dyes subsequently for cottons. So completely different routes in many ways. They try to produce things in the opposite way to this kind of herbal way. They're doing things in reverse. Instead of boiling herbs together to come up with something that gives you the runs, they were trying to extract things from things to find what the active ingredient was. And they were doing it in a kind of scientific way. Yeah? They were doing it, you know, they had a hypothesis and they tested it. And this leads to you all know these stories. So this leads to this kind of classic example of Edward Jenner. Edward Jenner is not the first one to experiment with inoculation, but he's a famous example that wouldn't get through modern day ethics committees. Okay, so he observed that milkmaids didn't get smallpox. Smallpox is really, really horrible. It's one of the few things that we have successfully eradicated. It only exists illegally, I believe, for biological warfare. So, the Russians probably have it, so the Americans, although they say they haven't got it, they probably got it because to make the antidote, you need small samples of it. But it's hugely lethal. So if we were to unleash it in London today, it would kill 97% of us. That's phenomenal, yeah? So, so having an inoculation for smallpox is actually quite handy. So what Jenner does is he injects James Phipps with cowpox and then subsequently injects him with smallpox, which is almost immediately lethal, yeah. And I believe, I might be wrong, but I believe James Phipps is 8 years old, yeah. So this kind of empiricism, wonderful it is, wouldn't comply with modern day ethics committees, but it was successful, okay. And so by 1840, this is inoculation, yeah? Giving people small samples of diseases. But by 1840, we had a vaccination. So that's pretty good. This following sort of late 19th century, if you like, examples of chemists, they're trying to synthetically come up with what is naturally produced. So this is the roots, if you like, of modern pharmacology. This is the chemical formula. Chemists amongst you can now come in and tell me I'm wrong, and I will have no way of knowing. This is the chemical formula of aspirin. So first modern drugs, synthetic organic chemistry rather than herbalism or quacks are the roots of modern pharmacology. And modern pharmacology, bear in mind that this is economic history, we are looking at this from a business perspective. Modern pharmacology, because of its chemical roots, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, lends itself to mass production methods, okay? So, or at least lends itself to economies of scale, unlike herbalism in this period, which is handy. And it really takes a lot of its roots from German and Swiss dyeing technology. And so this is why America and Britain aren't dominant. And they gain their dominance from Germany losing various wars, essentially. And therefore, as war preparations, just either seizing patents or abolishing patents. So these are some of the leading Swiss and German players in the dye industry and subsequently in pharmaceutical industry, still existing. So Bayer develops aspirin, and aspirin now sells something like very cheaply, yeah, because it's now seen as, strangely enough, it's having a new lease of life as a wonder cancer drug, isn't it? And you can buy, I don't know, 12 aspirin for almost 12p in not Bayer's. I do notice that German friends of mine do insist on buying Bayer aspirins rather than the generics that you can buy in Asda or Sainsbury's or Tesco's for 30p, 16p, whatever it is a pack. But we now consume 40 billion tablets a year of aspirin. This is an early Bayer advert of some of the products that they were retailing. One is aspirin, and it was called aspirin because once you didn't have a headache anymore, you could aspire to greater things. Those that have longer, better eyesight will see that heroin is down there as well, which was another. Bayer didn't invent heroin, but they were the first to successfully manufacture it and market it. It was developed by a British chemist for similar reasons to Bayer, because they strangely thought it was less addictive than morphine. So a synthetic version of, you notice that aspirin, that is a synthetic version of bark, of a naturally occurring drug in willow bark. And that's the chemical formula for that. This is a kind of 3D chemical formula for heroin. I did feel a little bit self-conscious downloading these from the internet. I wondered when I was going to get a knock on the door. Okay, so this is a bottle of Bayer heroin, commercialised, and it was called heroin because I'm not sure about this, but this is what I've read. It's called heroin because it brings the hero out in you. And whenever I want to spell heroin, I just think hero in. So obviously it's a synthetic version of morphine, and it was sold as a very effective cough medicine, hugely effective, because when you have a cough, very often you'll have a temperature and your respiratory rate will increase, the glands around the throat contract. As they contract, they rub against each other, and in rubbing against each other, that causes irritation, which will cause you to cough. If you take heroin, your respiratory rate declines. Another benefit is you don't sleep very well. I'm not advocating heroin as a cough medicine, but it was a very successful cough medicine. It's maybe quite good if you get TB. I think for other things, maybe it's the cure is worse than the symptoms. That's what I'm looking for. But it was successfully marketed, and it did work. It was available in Britain in a cough mixture until the 1960s. And it was only illegal in Britain in the 1960s. It was illegal in the US quite a lot earlier on, in about 1925, I think. This is an advert, a Bayer advert for wholesale heroin, yeah? Wholesale heroin as for manufacturers of various cough mixtures. The problem they had in the US, though, was a similar problem to something I came across on Al Jazeera, which is this wonga, which is a pretty horrible recreational drug. But in the US, people get breaking into the warehouse to steal the heroin, and that was a big problem. And that's why I believe the wholesalers, various laws come in at various stages. One law came in to ban the wholesale of it about 1914. It was illegal to possess it possibly about 1925 or something, but not until about 1960 in Britain. But this is something that I came across on Al Jazeera about anti-AIDS drugs. And now anti-AIDS drugs were, well, the South African government was in denial for a long time, until relatively recently, when finally they became generic versions of expensive drugs were available free of charge. You know, there's an AIDS epidemic in Africa. However, it's been discovered that people are, I kid you not, people are mixing Stoprin, brand name, with rat poison and detergent, and then smoking it with cannabis and or smoking forms of heroin. It's a pretty horrible concoction that causes lots of other negative symptoms, a brief high apparently, but as a consequence, people are selling their life-saving drugs instead of consuming them themselves. So very similar to what happened to heroin. Okay, so Britain and America did have synthetic chemical companies, but ICI and DuPont, but neither of them really made a mark. Okay, but where Britain did make its mark was in antibiotics, was in the development of penicillin. Okay, so we know the story of Alexander Fleming, 1928. Okay, again, product innovation. Okay, product innovation to the extent that we never really got the process innovation at all. It took over 10 years, again, university stuff, small scale, to actually reliably make it. Not reliably make it at a rate that was economically viable, but 1939 is a date that comes to mind, and the Second World War intervenes. Now that's good, and it's bad. It's good because suddenly antibiotics are available for the Second World War, and not initially for what you think. Bad because we can't do it. We can't make it. We can make 32 samples. We can't make enough of it to make it available to soldiers on the front, to people with injuries, in anything like the quantities that is needed. So we give it without royalties to the US, and Pfizer develop the process innovation, develop a way of making it cheaply, and mass producing it. Okay, so here it says penicillin cures gonorrhea in 4 hours. See your doctor today. So a lot of these things are actually made. So sexually transmitted disease. You think of soldiers on the front line. Well, the first and biggest impact is dealing with sexually transmitted diseases. Okay, so another correlation with the AIDS drugs. Okay, so penicillin is pretty useful, but it's a very narrow spectrum that it can deal with. So it's not until after the Second World War really that broader spectrum antibiotics are created, and this is done in America. This is done with Pfizer, and you will see the extent to which this has an impact on export sales of pharmaceuticals alone. This isn't all of chemicals, so this isn't industrial chemicals, this isn't consumer chemicals, this is just pharmaceuticals. And America really dominates, with its process innovation, with antibiotics, and then broad spectrum antibiotics. And Germany just loses out because it loses all the patents. As a consequence of war reparations. So Second World War intervenes and Germany starts at a very low base again. Okay, so what the economics of this is how it intervenes in terms of ethics. So the ability for drug companies to make a lot of money selling life-saving drugs. Now there was a big debate about this in South Africa about producing generic varieties of very expensive anti-AIDS drugs. But this is the reverse of that, if you like, and this is the ethic that's still there to an extent, and still there creating a successful Schumpeterian industry, the ability to make monopoly profits, essentially, yeah. And if you do make a blockbuster drug, a drug that is better than everything else on the market, the industry is such that you will make a lot of money. So again, just ramming that home, it's about this part of the chemical industry is all about products innovation and not process innovation. It doesn't, other than the Alexander Fleming thing, it doesn't really matter how much it costs to produce. Okay, so some examples of brute success. I'm not going to go through all of them. Okay, so penicillin, Zantac. Until Viagra, Zantac, which I think is an anti-ulcer drug, was the most successful drug by revenue. And then comes Viagra. Okay, now this is why I got told off for my chemical lecture in that and the heroin in Queen Mary. Okay, so a friend's father managed the Sandwich laboratory that developed Viagra, and during the process, this was developed as a drug, as a heart disease drug. And so they had some patients in a Kent hospital, and they gave 4 times the recommended dose of Viagra to the patients. And the patients are mostly old, male and female. And they noticed that the male patients, okay, so you're in a hospital ward, you're old, you haven't got many clothes on, most of the nurses are female, that the male patients who had 4 times the recommended dose of Viagra were rolling over on their front. Yeah, they were lying on their front all the time, and they thought this is strange. And so, the people conducting the study and the doctor said, why are you lying on your front? So they said, it's too sore to do otherwise. And they thought this is really strange. 50% of our sample have back problems or pain, and they can't move around very much, and the other 50% are okay. But the other 50% were women, so I thought this might be just an issue with men. Okay, so then they did another sample, a men-only sample, and in this men-only sample they then had male doctors, and so the men didn't mind discussing the unfortunate side effects, or if you are FIFO, the fortunate side effects of Viagra. And Viagra being developed as a drug to counter problems with the heart didn't have the problems that you would expect from these fortunate or unfortunate symptoms. So FIFO immediately realised that they were onto a winner here, a big winner. To the extent that this has been the most successful drug by revenue to date, which is quite ironic, because we'll get there in the end if I have time. It's quite ironic that the sandwich plant that developed and manufactured Viagra, FIFO's, but not only FIFO's, any drug company's most successful drug of all time. Now, it's probably not counting all the illicit sales of heroin, but difficult to collate that. It's being closed down. You are aware of that. There was a very good article I'll refer to right at the end in the FT from about 3 weeks ago about the closure of the sandwich plant. Yeah, that sandwich plant is a research institute that's actually part of a factory, and it's partly the economics of that. Again, back to process and product innovation. That didn't work for FIFO. Anyway, big changes in that industry, but also partly big changes for regulatory reasons, and we'll come back to that. Okay, but pharmaceuticals, this doesn't look that dramatic, okay, so we're going from almost nothing to nearly 3% as a percentage of manufacturing output, but it is significant. We, through a lot of that period, are world leaders. So why was Britain so successful? Well, partly because of the NHS, and partly because of how the NHS priced drugs, so the incentive structure, and partly just because of the nature of the industry. Okay, so we will briefly discuss thalidomide and the consequences of it. So partly the industry avoided, but only just, nationalisation. Now that might have had an impact on British success in pharmaceuticals. So the other factor is high levels of scientific expertise in universities, and then the nature of the industry. Okay, so the role of the NHS. The NHS buys almost all UK drugs, okay? And there's this voluntary pricing regulation. This is really important. The NHS will pay the full market price for the first 3 years. The full market price is what rich Americans will pay for a drug, okay? And then it will pay a reasonable price related to export prices subsequently. So there are these massive Schumpeterian incentives, okay? But there need to be. And the NHS always bought the best drug. Unlike some other countries, it didn't. This isn't British Leyland. This isn't the post office buying Sherpa vans. The NHS bought the best drug regardless of where it came from. I've got a few examples, which I probably haven't got time for, of non-British drugs, expensive drugs, that the NHS buys. So British pharmaceuticals companies need to be good. They need to produce the best drug, or they're not going to sell it. So that's another incentive. So there's a kind of stick and carrot thing, like the free beer, but having to listen to Gurdon talk about courses, okay? So the same kind of incentive structure the NHS offers the British pharmaceutical industry. Okay, so you've heard of the thalidomide, can I say that? Thalidomide disaster, yeah? Okay, so there was basically it was a sedative, it was a morning sickness pill. It seems really trivial, considering the consequences of it. That was available in the late 50s and very early 60s. It had a massive effect, and the effect was, there's a medical term for this which is derived from a Greek word. The Greek word is absolutely awful, so I'm not going to use it. But basically, the birth defects were very short-lived, very, very short-lived. You only need a very, very small dose of this. You only need to take it once or twice to cause these dramatic, huge, awful side effects. It was not a British drug, it was a German drug. It was licensed in 46 countries, but not licensed in the US. This is France's Kelsey, Dr. Frances Kelsey, and she was a Food and Drug Administration inspector, and she dug her heels in and did not allow the licensing of thalidomide in the US, and there she is shaking hands with President Kennedy. But some doctors did prescribe thalidomide in test cases in the US, but mostly the US avoided this catastrophe, and it was a really big catastrophe that affected thousands of people in Europe. People are now getting quite old, so even older than me. Okay, but the drug thalidomide is back, but it's back. It was never licensed in the US by the Food and Drug Administration until 1996, and again re-licensed in 2006, and it's a treatment used quite widely in Brazil, but also used against melanoma, which is a form of skin cancer, but it's used most of these, not leprosy maybe, but a lot of these things are old age diseases, so then you're not likely to be pregnant and have some of these things. But it is, because it causes these deformities, it also kills cells, and so it can be quite useful as a treatment against various forms of cancer. So it is back, the drug thalidomide, but used very carefully and not with pregnant women. Okay, this clip going to work. Yeah. Okay, so this was the shadow health secretary who subsequently became health secretary in Wilson's government. Okay, so he was in opposition at the time of thalidomide, and he said any drug manufacturer could market any products, however inaccurately tested, however dangerous. This was the threat of nationalisation for the pharmaceuticals industry, which was only just narrowly avoided, if you like. It was a Tory administration. They set up the Dunlop Committee, named after the chairman of that committee, who then set up the Committee for Safety in Medicines, which existed until 2005, replaced by the Commission on Human Medicines. The point is, it's staffed by academics, and it's empirically based, and mostly we have avoided things like the thalidomide. Yes, there are errors, but there aren't the errors that there were without this, and maybe there aren't the consequences that we would have had we had nationalisation. One of the things that if you spoke to any of those off the record, they would say what is critical is animal testing. This is not a popular thing to say, but it's hugely important, and this is a factor in, if you like, the more recent failure of the pharmaceuticals industry. It's popular discomfort with what some scientists do, and it's also some forms of regulation in testing, both testing on human beings and testing on animals. But had thalidomide been tested on animals, it wouldn't have been the problem that it subsequently was. So another reason that the UK does very well is, yes, universities, but also the fact that people like me get paid very little. So we are cheap, okay? So UCL and Imperial lead the world. You are aware of this, okay? The UK Centre for Medical Research and Innovation, which is a massive investment. The construction begins in a month's time, and it will be the world's biggest bioscience project, very near here, just behind St Pancras, so close to UCL, University Hospital, relatively close to. So we're in the conglomeration economies again, okay? The other thing that London has, huge benefit, is you lot and me, okay? It has this vast spectrum of humanity from all over the world to test things out on. So these are huge benefits. That and the fact that we're cheap. Academics are cheap here. They're not cheap in America. They're not cheap in Germany. The nature of the industry, lastly, when we buy drugs, not illicit drugs off the street, but when we buy prescription drugs, we're not interested in what they cost. We're partly not interested in what they cost because we don't pay for them. In most rich countries, it's the government or it's an insurance company that pays for the drugs. We don't care. All we want is the best, okay? We're not going to go there with our armaments and say, what's the cheapest way of dealing with this? What's the most effective way? So it's the nature of the industry, and again, product innovation rather than process innovation. It's a strange industry where mostly the consumers are indifferent to price, the end user consumers. The likelihood is we're a perfect sample here because we're sort of intelligentsia. Over half of us will have some form of mental illness at some point. I have a permanent mental illness, as you probably noticed. There are two ways of dealing with this form of unipolar depression. One's cheap, one's expensive. When you go to your doctor will initially try you with 3 weeks of that. If that is unsuccessful, then they'll go straight to the expensive one, yeah? And so it's not a price-conscious sector.